talking to all my friends on the phone constantly about what I was feeling and what I was doing, whatever. And I did finally make the decision because you have to go to the coach and say,
Today on the show, we have a former gymnast. Jennifer Lazar is up next.
Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'm excited to start this new year off with episode number 30 and a different take on the fifth quarter with today's guest. So before we dive deep into our conversation with today's guest, thank you, and a huge thank you again to all of our listeners. All of your comments and your notes of encouragement, plus those official reviews, is what encourages me and helps me direct upcoming episodes and guests. I appreciate each and every one of you who's taken the time to listen, to share, to talk about it, to comment, whatever, every single week. And all of you are important to our success. Today's guest is a former gymnast raised right here in Memphis, Tennessee. And coincidentally, we are recording this episode on the birthday of Elvis Presley, which is only fitting since we're both from Memphis. Welcome to the show, Jennifer Lazar.
thanks so much for having me, Sandy. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited to have you. You know, you were here for Christmas. You live in California now. We'll get into that in a second. You were here over Christmas and we were talking, and I was telling you about the podcast, and we started talking about this, which I had not known you were a former gymnast. Or maybe I did, because we have literally known each other since 1988, I think.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Each
So
other a
so
long time.
I know. So we've known each other for a really, really long time. And we're going to get into all of those specifics on this podcast. So thank you very much for doing this. Let's just dive right into, and I'm just going to be honest, guys, I've lost my questions out here. I'm not all together. It's my first interview of the new year. So let's start off with, what do you do today? Like, what's your profession today?
Well, Sandy, that's kind of interesting because I am starting fresh with my
Right.
life.
You are.
So,
Another pivot.
right,
So
another chapter,
right.
another fifth, kind of another fifth quarter.
Right.
So I lived in Austin, Texas for about 26 years, and I built a thriving bodywork practice there. And in 2022, I closed my 23-year bodywork practice in Austin and sold my home of 25 years. And I moved to my dream location of Fort Bragg, California. Um, so, so I'm starting over completely because you can't bring all your massage clients with you as much as I want to.
Right.
So I'm a body worker, but I also am something called a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. And I got certified about a year and a half ago. And so I help people who have not found answers to their nagging physical symptoms and physiological
Right.
symptoms when they've been through all the medical tests and the doctor looks at them and says, all your lab work looks completely normal. We have no idea what's going on in your body. They find me and I run functional lab tests and I run multiple functional lab tests.
Right.
We test every system in the body to help people achieve the vibrant wellness that they are seeking. So
Um,
I'm doing body work and nutrition at the same time. So it's a dream for me to combine those two.
so for people out there that may not understand the term body work, is massage therapy plus
It
structural
is
stuff?
massage therapy, but I do structural body work. So I am looking for symmetry in the body. I'm looking for the
Mhm.
hips to be level, the leg length to be even. I'm looking for the joints in your spine to be opening and closing properly when you bend forwards and backwards. I'm
Okay.
looking for your shoulders to be level, and I'm looking for your head to be on straight. Can't believe how many people's heads are not on straight, and literally, and maybe a little metaphorically too. But so where I find those asymmetries in the body, I do a full postural assessment when I first start to work with someone.
Right.
And then where I find asymmetries, I do a very gentle group of techniques that originate with osteopaths. It's a contract relax technique. So it releases the soft tissue that's holding a joint out of alignment.
Okay.
So it's kind of like it's the soft tissue side of chiropractic. So I don't
Hmm.
crack anything. I'm not a chiropractor,
Right.
but I can align and balance the body. And historically, what it means is symmetry in the body equals comfort. So
Right.
when you've got a high shoulder or a rotated pelvis, it will change the way that all the muscular attachments function. And that's what creates pain for people.
Sure.
So most people find me when they're looking for a solution to some kind of pain.
So, interesting enough, a lot of former athletes have pain in all different areas. So your services right now are both in person, and for those out there, because I kind of thought the same thing when she said she was moving to Fort Bragg, California. I immediately thought about the military base, but that is not it.
No, there's no
That-
military base here.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of a hippie place. Is that kind of how
Um,
you?
Fort Bragg is an old logging town. So
Okay.
there's a big mill here that closed, I want to say back in the early 2000s. So it's an old logging town, it's an old fishing town. It's right on the ocean.
And
And
it's north of San Francisco, correct?
yeah, it's about 150 miles north of San Francisco, but it takes 3.5 hours to get here because about 90 miles of it is hairpin turns through a beautiful valley with redwood forest. And this is just one of the most beautiful places I've ever been.
Wow.
The coastline here is stunning, and Fort Bragg is kind of the economy up here is pretty depressed. There was also a lot of the marijuana industry was focused around this area, and when marijuana got legalized, it changed a lot of situations for the small growers in this area.
Right.
So it's kind of an old mill town, an old fishing town, an old growing town. There's hippies and everything in between, good old boys, and there's everybody here. But everybody loves the ocean.
Yes, that
Everybody loves the ocean and the redwood forest. We can all agree on that.
that's true. So back to my question, you take people in person.
Yep.
Now, do you do any services via Zoom or online? So you do that
Yes.
as well. But
So
obviously that's not the body
right. So
work.
the bodywork services are in person, although some of my clients from Austin, I will do Zooms with because I can help teach them how to correct something.
Okay.
I can guide them to correct something that's bothering
Sure.
them, or I can help show them exercises or something else via Zoom that will
Right.
help them alleviate the pain that they're having in the moment.
Okay.
That's always been my goal, is not to just help someone feel better, but to teach them why they have the pain that they have, and for them to learn how to work with their own body to
Right.
be able to change that, because 90% of our human pain is human error in
Yes.
the way we sit, the way we stand, the way we walk, the way we sleep, the way we
Yep.
sit in
Me.
our
Yep.
cars. Yeah. So I do car seat adjustments for people. People bring me their cars and I change the positioning of their car seat and their steering wheel.
Oh, that's
I teach people sleeping positions because you spend so much time, a huge part of your
right.
life is spent in bed. So I teach people, I go to people's homes and I do ergonomics consults for them to help them set up their computer system better,
Right.
all of that. So my goal is always to teach people, because pain is so scary, because it seems like this mysterious thing,
Sure.
but pain doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens for a reason, and it's your body trying to get your attention and say,
Right.
"Hey, this isn't working for me."
Right.
So my goal is always to teach people how to help themselves, rather than I'm being the only source of help for you. I can't do
Right.
that 24/7. I can't do
Well,
that.
exactly. I mean, that mindset in itself is how businesses scale, is when you can help you can reach more people with less time that you have to put out.
Right.
So I'm going to go ahead and tell, for anybody that's interested, you can go to her website at Jennifer Lazar, LAZAR.com. And I'll be putting this into the podcast notes and everything with links there. But let's get back to
Can I
you
tell you one more
group.
thing?
Oh, yes.
I
Yeah.
want to tell
No,
you
no.
one more thing, because you asked me
Sure.
if I do everything in person.
Yes.
So the other part of that is that the nutrition work that I do
Oh,
is
yes.
completely virtual. I can do that
Yes.
work with anyone anywhere in the world, because I send people test kits for samples that they can take at home
Hmm.
and mail the test kit into the lab.
Right.
Then I get the lab result, and then we use the beautiful technology of Zoom to
Yes.
go through labs and for me to coach them into health.
Okay, excellent. So you can again find all that information on our website. And if you have questions after this, you can always send them to me or send them directly to Jennifer, and she'll be happy to answer you. I always love doing podcasts with my friends because I end up learning all these other things that we don't always talk about. Like, we don't always talk about our work,
Right.
and so I really like, as I said, I didn't even realize, I don't think, that you were a gymnast growing up. And I loved the fact that, all of our episodes up until now, the athletes have always, yes, they started their sports relatively early, um, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And then they would go until, their 20s, 30s. Heck, we had one guy, Andre Turner from the University of Memphis, coaches at Lane College. He played basketball until he was 45, 44, 45 years old in Spain.
I remember Andre Turner. He was
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, awesome interview I had with him. So, I found it fascinating because for gymnasts, your career starts early and you don't have as many years. You kind of reach your peak in your late teens and definitely early 20s, unless you're someone like Simone Biles. And, especially for women, you may have growth spurts, your body changes, and you have to get used to those different proportions and things like that. So there's a lot of differences between a gymnast and, say, a football or basketball player, or even a soccer player. So I was excited to have a different twist on this today. And so let's just start off just kind of mentioning this, and then we're going to get into all the things that led up to that. What age do you think, or did your fifth quarter start? And that would be your retirement from competitive athletics.
Well, my fifth quarter from gymnastics started when I was probably 13 or 14.
Okay.
I never can remember if it was 13 or 14.
That's okay.
I continued doing ballet for
I
another
didn't know that.
7 years. Well, gymnastics and ballet go hand in hand. And when I started doing gymnastics, when I got onto a competitive team, you were required to do
Oh,
ballet
yes.
because
Yes.
of the dance aspect.
Right.
And I did actually go on to dance in an apprentice company in ballet when I was 12.
Did not know
Um,
that.
but because of the way that I am physically built, I'm built like Mary Lou Retton.
Okay.
So when I was in ballet, all the dance teachers used to refer to me as our little gymnast because I was kind of short and squat and built like a gymnast with
Right.
explosive legs, as opposed to those long, lean, beautiful lines that ballet dancers have.
Right.
So while they let me dance, I wasn't really like built for it.
Um, and I suddenly lost my question that I had in my head when you were talking about that. Um, so the fifth quarter, about 13 or 14.
Yep.
And, when we were talking, when we first got on the Zoom today, you had talked, and let's talk about that too, because you said that, when we talked over Christmas, you were like, oh my God, I would love to do that. I think that's awesome. But after, you've been thinking about it, you were nervous. You were having some hesitation about that. And I wanted you to kind of speak to that because I think, and I know that several athletes, I believe, have put off talking on the podcast for various reasons. And I want you to kind of share why you had a hesitation or why you were kind of nervous.
Well, you know, I think things are changing in the athletics world, which is
Sure.
a really good thing. They need to change.
Right.
But my when I think back about being a gymnast, it's a little bit bittersweet. So, gymnastics taught me so many things that are so valuable in my life today
Right.
and have helped me be successful in various aspects of my life and have guided me to where I am today. And there are other aspects of gymnastics that are kind of not good to think about. And I mean, I was having a conversation with someone last night that almost all athletes have some history of being being abused in some way,
Right.
whether it's their image exploited, whether it's emotional or whatever it is, because coaching people, especially in gymnastics, you're doing things that are life-threatening. I mean, you're
Sure.
flying through the air.
Right.
And we're not talking about someone overexerting and having a heart attack and dying. We're
Right.
talking about some of the skills that you do in gymnastics could literally kill you.
Right.
Our human um, drive is to stay alive. So some of the things that you have to learn to do in sports are really dangerous, and your self-preservation kicks in, and you should be afraid to do a double back. Like, that's
Right.
scary.
Right.
And the way that you are coached to do those things, because it's so not natural to do something so dangerous with your body. So the way that people approach coaching is, some of it is fear-based. And they instill fear in athletes where, you should be more afraid of me than you are of hurting
Right.
yourself doing that thing that I'm asking you to do. And so you have this, um, the dynamic and the relationship between an athlete and their coach is a fascinating psychological relationship.
Right.
And when you have that relationship at such a young age, where, you aren't a fully developed person and you don't know what you want in the world, and you have a person who's telling you that you better be more afraid of them as a human being than you are of injuring your body,
Sure.
because what they'll do if you don't do what they want you to do. So it's something that I think a lot of athletes have been through, feeling like they have been in abusive situations with coaches. The coaches want the best for you. And
We hope they all do.
I think they do.
Yeah.
Well, and also they want the best for their organization. I think
Sure.
when you're talking about professional athletes, I think you're talking about, then there's a money equation that
It
makes it.
becomes, and really quickly, somebody said the other day, and I forgot who it was. They said, when you start getting paid for a sport, it's no longer a sport, it's a business.
Right. And your body doesn't belong to you anymore.
That's
It
right.
belongs
That's
to the
right.
organization that's paying you.
That's right.
Um, and so I worked with a lot of athletes in my practice. To One of my purposes was to help them find their voice with their sport.
Right.
So for me, one of the things that was nervous about me is, for me doing this, is is it valuable to talk about that now? I mean, so much has come out, especially in the gymnastics world,
Sure.
about
Yes.
what's happened. And it happens in, not the sexual abuse, but abuse of some kind happens in every gymnastics gym in the United States,
Sure.
probably in the world. It just does. Because it's not natural for people to fling their bodies through the air like that. In
No,
terms of, it's
and if
not
you
something that you would do.
and
It's not important to your survival.
it's not. And if we look back, I think Simone Biles during the Summer Olympics, back in what, 2022?
Yes.
2020, yes,
Yeah.
2022. I- Whenever the last Summer Olympics,
Yeah.
I think that that was an important lesson for everyone, that
Yes.
she stood up and said, I'm not going to do this because mentally I can't work through it, you
Yes.
know? And look at all the backlash she got from so many people about that. But I think that was a wonderful thing. And then you saw a tennis player, and I can't remember her name. She came out later, and she had some personal issues too, and she's like, I'm not going to play tennis. And it obviously wasn't from a danger perspective, but it really started talking about mindset, because mindset affects everything you do, whether it is
Right.
dangerous or not. It
Yep.
affects your performance in whatever way. And I think athletes overall can honestly, relate to that. Let's jump back into, when did you start gymnastics
So I started gymnastics when I was 4 years old.
and why? Why did you start gymnastics?
That is a great question, because when you're 4 years old, your
Exactly.
parents are just like, well, here, let's put you in a little toddler gymnastics
Because
class and a little
because
ballet.
I'll be honest, I love gymnastics. I always wanted to do it. I took tumbling, but I had a spine problem, so I could not do it. And I was scared. But I remember watching, and this is going to age me, Nadia Comaneci getting the perfect 10 when she was in Romania in the Olympics.
Yep.
Like, she was my idol.
Yep. She was my idol too.
Yeah,
Well, pardon me, I've got a little bit of
that's okay.
allergy today.
That's okay.
Prior to Nadia Comaneci was Olga Korbut. And
Yes.
I loved Olga Korbut. But the other thing is, I share a birthday with Nadia Comaneci.
Oh
And
my God.
I was mesmerized by her when I was a little girl. And to the point where, and there are other circumstances around this, but when I was 8 years old, my parents almost sent me to Romania to train with Bella Caroli. That's how serious about gymnastics I was. And I ended up not going. I think it was like a summer camp intensive kind of thing. And
Right.
I ended up not going because they couldn't guarantee that Nadia was going to be there. And I was like, I'm
Um,
going to go to Romania by myself and she's not even going to be there. I don't know if I want to do that, you know?
Now you could
But
just go to Oklahoma because she lives there.
right,
Yeah.
right. And well, and that was long before Bella
Yeah.
Caroli defected to the US and all of that. But yeah, I mean, she was every little gymnast's dream.
She was.
Yeah, for sure.
So it goes back to that. Why did your parents stick you in gymnastics?
I suspect I'm a very high energy person.
Mhm.
And I'm the youngest of four kids. And I think that I was probably, well, and also, okay, I think I was probably a twirly kid.
Right.
I was running around and kind of twirly, and they were like, "What are we going to do with all this energy?" And so, oh, let's do gymnastics and ballet. So I think that was part of it. And then I also think that the I probably started ballet before gymnastics because that was something that was done at school, and we had a ballet teacher at school.
And you went to a private school.
I went to a private girls' school,
Right.
and I
Which I think also leads into that getting you into those type of
yes,
sports.
because ballet, I believe that private girls' schools and lots of private girls' schools at that time had ballet. And I think that it was it was the 70s, it was the early
Right.
70s. And I think that part of that was about sort of turning you into an elegant woman
Sure.
by teaching you how to move and teaching, posture. Remember when people used to put a book on their head,
Yes.
and so ballet, like starting little girls in ballet early was the next iteration of that attempt to teach you good posture.
Right.
And then I found out that there was gymnastics too. And I was like, oh my gosh, so I think I probably asked to do gymnastics. And I think my parents were like, yep, she's twirly. Let's
Yeah.
let her do something
Yeah.
twirly.
When did when was there a day when or and that was the other thing we talked about, for you, um, your sport was really a long time ago. A lot of
Yeah.
the other athletes, it's still been like 10, 15, 20 years at the most that
Yeah.
they, stopped playing. But for you, it was much longer. And so it was things you hadn't even thought about. But can you recall a time when you just remember loving gymnastics?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I loved it from the minute I walked in the gym and started learning how to do cartwheels. And, I mean, I loved it. And I was good at it. And, I mean, who doesn't love to do something that you're good at?
Sure, sure.
And I loved it. I loved it for a really long time. I mean, I ate, drank, slept it. I mean, yeah. I mean, there's something very freeing and fun about flying through the
Sure,
air
sure.
under your own steam.
Right.
So yeah.
Which which I think that basketball players can kind of relate to as well,
Yeah.
um, for that type of thing. So, do you recall a specific time when it turned where you didn't or actually, no, let's talk about what was a typical day like for you when you really got into the competitive part of it? Because I think,
So
for gymnastics, I'm not sure if it's more intensive than and it may not be, than a football, basketball, soccer player
I
or
don't think
tennis player.
I don't think well, I think it can be more intensive in different ways. So I think it is more intense at an earlier age.
Yes, I agree.
So, like, by the time that kids are in junior high and high school playing football, they do two a day. If they're really good
Right,
football, they do two a day workouts, they do that kind of stuff.
right.
For gymnasts, that can start much earlier, which it did for me. So, I was doing gymnastics 35 hours a week by the time I was 9 years old. So,
That's almost a full-time job
yes,
in
it was.
addition to school.
Yes. And a lot of, I mean, at that time, and I think it's probably still true, a lot of girls who were elite athletes, if you were an elite gymnast, you would go and live somewhere else
Yes.
where you would have private tutoring and, school
Right.
was sort of secondary to gymnastics. I wasn't that person. I went to a regular school. Well, I went to a Montessori school.
Right.
Um, and I lived at home. But so it was like I'd get up, run out the door with, this is terrible to even say it, but my sister and I would run out the door with a Diet Coke. My dad used to call it Memphis orange juice. And there they go with the Memphis orange juice. But I'd get up and go to school, and then right after school, because my gymnastics team practiced at the school where I went to school, I would walk across the street and I would go to gymnastics for 4 or 5 hours, and I'd get home at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And I would, in the beginning, when I wasn't yet competing, that would happen for a few days a week. But as I started competing, that was every day. That was 5 days a week.
Wow.
And then, 6 or 7 hours on a Saturday, depending on
Sure.
the season and what was going on. And then in the summertime, you'd go to gymnastics camps for 2 weeks at a time. And one summer I went to 3 different gymnastics camps that were 2 weeks at a time, and you did gymnastics 10 hours a day.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
it's a lot. And when I got old enough to want to have a social life, like seventh grade, I can remember it being this big um, kind of argument, because the big thing when we were in the seventh grade was roller skating. Like
Oh,
on
yes.
Saturday night, you'd go to the roller skating rink.
Right.
And there were times when, if it was competition season, I wasn't allowed to do that, because what if I fell and broke my wrist or twisted my ankle and I couldn't compete? So you protected your body for your sport,
Right.
so that, so there were lots of things like at PE at school, I wasn't allowed to play soccer because they didn't want me twisting my ankles.
Yeah.
So
So
there
do
was,
you,
go ahead.
well, what I was going to say is now let's talk about when did it become not fun for you that you can remember?
I think it became not fun as my skill level increased. Um, I had some injuries, and in fact, I got kicked off the team for a period of time because I had something called Osgood-Schlatter's, which is very common in athletes.
What is that?
It's a disorder that happens in your knees. It's an imbalance between your quads and your hamstrings, and it changes the way that the bones in your knees form. And in the 70s, when I got, and when you have it, it's very painful, and your knees will sort of collapse on you, and it's very scary. Like your knees can collapse on you walking downstairs. And doing deep knee bends is very uncomfortable. You can't sit on your knees because you end up with this big knot on your knee. And anyway, and so I got it. A lot of gymnasts get it. Catchers in baseball also get it. It's a pretty
Right.
common thing for kids to get as they're developing. And the treatment at that time was to cast your legs and completely cast your legs for 6 weeks.
Oh my God.
And I didn't want to do that, but I also was in a position where I was in pain and afraid. And the coach would say, do this. And I'd say, but my knees hurt. And they'd say, well, you better do that or you're going to be in trouble, or some kind of consequence.
So how old were you at that time?
I was probably 11
Okay.
or so. And so what ended up happening was a coach got angry at me and they kicked me off the team. And so, which actually in hindsight turned out to be a good thing,
Good.
because my knees healed. And then I got invited back to the team, and I went back, and I had lost so much of my fitness and my skills. And it was really challenging to get those back for me.
Right.
Um, but I did go on and continue to compete for a little while longer. But, when you start to do those bigger ticket skills, double backs, and you're,
Right.
flying between bars and you're doing aerial moves on the balance beam, the risk for injury goes up too.
Yeah.
And the more injuries you rack up, I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a gymnast who's never landed on their head.
Right.
And the injuries start to rack up. And as the injuries rack up and as the skills get more and more and your coaches are pushing you harder and harder, you become afraid. I mean, once you're old enough to realize that you should be afraid of these things, you become afraid which is normal.
It is
Uh,
normal.
yeah, and but then when you get into that gridlock with your coach about doing it or not doing it, and the kind of thing where, remember, if your parents wanted you to eat something at the table and you wouldn't eat it, they'd make you sit
Sure.
there for
Right.
however long. Yeah.
Right.
So a coach would make you, if you wouldn't do something on the balance beam, I mean, you could be at the gym until 10:30 at night because the coach would be standing there just waiting for you to do the thing. And
Wow.
you do it or you don't leave. I mean, you could stay at the I mean, I'd stayed at the gym until 10:30 at night before, with a coach waiting on me to do something that I was afraid to do.
And that really gets into the mental aspect of it. And it's, you know, the skills themselves are dangerous,
Yes.
especially like the balance beam and even like the tumbling on the floor exercise and the uneven bars. Um, you know, they're all very dangerous. So it's always it really comes down to a mental game within yourself.
Yes.
And I would think for a lot of gymnasts, I can't imagine that the love of the sport is greater than their fear. But I guess it is, or they're just pushed along. I remember Michael Phelps, after about a year or two after he ended his career, he talked about how he doesn't know when his goal of reaching the Olympics stopped, and it just became about what was expected of him.
Yes.
And I think for the gymnasts that have a really high skill set, I mean, Simone Biles is a special case, but I think
Right. She's a
there's
fully formed adult.
right,
Yeah,
right, and I think there's so many kids out there, women, girls, that I don't know, where does that love of the sport end? And it's just the fear that keeps pushing them on, the expectations. And then you get into, I don't necessarily think that the issues with women's gymnastics are as prevalent in men's gymnastics
I agree.
overall.
I agree.
But you get into body image for young girls, especially 9, 10, 11 years old, and then their body starts changing. We talked about that before we got on the recording, and there's growth spurts, both breast wise, leg wise, everything.
Yep.
And it's a lot of mental. Girls already have a hard enough time with the mental image of themselves without, that playing into it.
Yeah.
Listening to you talk, it sounds like your fifth quarter, soft fifth quarter,
Yeah.
really started with the knee issue when you were kicked off the team,
Yeah.
because that was kind of the beginning of the end going downward.
It was. And it's also really interesting, when you're talking about girls particularly. I
Mhm.
can't really speak to men's gymnastics because
Sure.
the club that I did gymnastics with, we didn't have a men's team.
Right.
So I wasn't so privy to that. But for girls, what's also really interesting to me about gymnastics specifically is that um, women in society are judged on so many things already.
Yes.
Little girls are being judged on whether or not their toes are pointed,
Yes.
and you are losing points for not pointing your toes or for letting your knee bend or for any of the things that you get a deduction for in gymnastics.
Right.
That level of judgment, at that level of minutia, I didn't really think about that until I was an adult.
Yeah.
When I started evaluating, when you grow up and you start to really evaluate who you are in the world and how you work, um, and you start to realize that you, as a child, you're terrified of being judged for your knee bending.
Right.
Like that's a big deal. Um, and something to think, and really, I mean, dancers too, but they don't get a score. But like having your body scored, and when I think about that with what I do now with people, because I do work with mindset and I coach
Right.
people through health stuff, um, just thinking about that level of judgment
Sure.
is it's amazing, and And gymnastics is changing, thank goodness. I'm glad it's changing. And one of the other things that has really changed since I was a gymnast that is really positive is the equipment has become forgiving and friendly. So
Right.
when I was a gymnast, the balance beam was made out of a solid block of wood.
Oh my God.
Right. And so if you fell on the balance beam, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Now it's covered in a nubuck and it's got padding
Right.
on it and it's
Right.
the beam itself is made out of fiberglass so it gives. You've
Right.
seen a balance beam kind of give a little bit.
Right.
The uneven bars were made out of solid wood. And in the
Oh,
70s, you wrapped the bars. So you'd cast a handstand and you'd come down and you'd slam your hand
yes.
on the low bar.
Yes.
You do that. Well, now they don't ever do that. And because the bars are so far apart, now women are swinging more like men on high bar.
Sure.
But now the bars are made out of fiberglass. You can see them at bend, right? When they're swinging on them.
Right.
That wasn't true when I was a gymnast.
I never knew they were made out of solid wood.
Yeah,
Like,
they were made out of
that's
solid wood.
crazy.
And then the floor exercise mat was everybody's been in a fitness gym where they have those blue and tan mats that fold
Sure.
out and
Yeah.
they're about an inch
Yeah.
thick. That's what the floor exercise
Yeah. I
mat
knew
was made
that.
of.
Yeah.
Well, and now it's about, I don't know, 6 inches thick and it's actually got foam springs in
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So the skills that people are doing now, and that's true in swimming too. They talked about the Olympics, whether or not it's a fast pool. They've made faster and faster pools
Sure.
that help the swimmers swim faster.
Right.
And now in gymnastics, you have all this equipment that's made of much better and forgiving materials that helps gymnasts fly higher and
Right.
get fewer injuries when they fall, which is
Sure.
a great,
It is a great thing.
it's a great advancement. Yeah.
It is, but on the opposite of that, it's pushing people to do higher skills that are much more dangerous,
Yes.
um, on top of all of that. So let's go back now and talk about was there a day that you made that decision, I don't want to do this anymore, or was it a slow? Because if we talk about how when you were kicked off the team, if that was kind of the start of your fifth quarter,
Yeah.
but when was that day? Was it your decision to just stop, or was it somebody else's decision, or when did that come?
It was my decision. It was something can remember because one of the things that also happens in your sport is you become in community with your teammates and your
Mhm.
coaches. And when you make the choice to leave the community, that's a big choice
It is.
because,
Because it's a family. It's a family.
yeah, it is. And especially as little girls, as gymnasts, all my gymnastics friends, those were my friends.
Right.
I mean, I had school friends, but there was no time to hang out with them because I was always doing gymnastics. And, I could go to a slumber party, but I'd have to get picked up at 8 o'clock the next morning because I'd have gymnastics.
Yeah.
So your gymnastics friends were your really close friends. So the process of making that decision was, talking to all my friends on the phone constantly about what I was feeling and what I was doing, whatever. And I did finally make the decision because you have to go to the coach and say, I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
And my coach, unfortunately, tried to guilt me into staying. Um, Another piece of this that for my story is that my mother died when I was 9 years old.
Right.
And my dad had three other kids and he was dealing with his own grief and with my siblings who were older than me. And I was the kid who was sort of like taken care of because I was
So,
doing gymnastics.
so one thing, what was the age difference between you and your next sibling up, which I
Three
think
and a
was
half
your
years.
three and a
My
half years?
sister, 3.5
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And so after my mom died, my coaches became my parents, kind of. I went and lived with coaches for a little while. Or I spent lots and lots of time at their houses, spending the night and staying with them and traveling with the team and all that sort of stuff. So leaving was a really big decision. And when I went to my coach and said, I don't want to do this anymore, she said to me, what would your mother say?
Oh.
And
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 one second. So if we talk about that age level too, so 9, 10 years old, kids, for the most part, they kind of understand things going on around them. They can
Yeah,
kind of comprehend, but on the other side, there's still kind of that kid mentality and they don't quite grasp everything. So you've
of
lost
course.
your mom,
Yep.
you're in this community, it's bringing you all this pain and discomfort and unhappiness, and you want to leave, and they throw that at you.
Yeah. And I have to say, I'm proud of myself at that age. I'm proud of little 9-year-old or little 13-year-old Jennifer
Right.
because I stood my ground and said, my mom's not here to talk about that. And I don't want to do this anymore.
Wow.
Um, which now, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in that. Nobody's ever really asked me that question. But when I think about it now, I'm proud of myself
Sure, you should be. You stood up for
because
yourself
I stood up
at
for myself.
13 years old, which is kind of hard to do for a girl, I think.
Yeah, it was. Well, especially one of the things about gymnastics with little girls, and I think it's true probably for young men also, is you become a people pleaser.
Yeah.
You want to get the good score. You want to appeal to you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of people pleasing that goes along with that. There's internal drive too. I mean, I was driving the boat on gymnastics. Nobody pushed me to, nobody made me go. In fact, a lot of times I didn't have a ride. I didn't have a way to get to practice. I did because at some point we moved out of the school and moved into a warehouse and all that. And I made it work. It was my job to find myself rides to and from the gym. It was, and I wanted it enough that I made it work. So I had the internal drive. It's not like anybody was making me do it.
You had the internal drive, and also you didn't have the mother figure there as well. Not to discount your father, but you also look at it as, you talk about gymnastics is all about people pleasing because you're trying to get a good score,
Right. Yeah.
essentially. Whereas basketball, football, soccer, it's all about a team unit to win. Or tennis where you're beating the other person, but here you're being scored on you. And you've
Yeah.
got to please the judges. You got to please the coaches.
Yeah. It's a
So,
totally different
yeah,
thing because, yes, there is team competition, but it's an individual who's competing on
yes,
behalf of a
that's
team
right. That's right.
as opposed to a cohesive unit of people who have to work together.
Right.
Those are different. And so while you have these teammates who you love, you are also in direct competition with
Yeah.
them. And coaches will often, in order to get what they want out of you, they
Mm-hmm.
will pit teammates against each other and say things like, "Hey, Jennifer, did you see what Stephanie just did?" And Jennifer goes, "Well, I don't want to be beat out." So I go over there and try to do the thing that Stephanie just did, even though I don't know how to do it or, whatever. So there's a team that's supposed to be cohesive. And then
Sure.
there's also fierce competition within the team
Right.
at a young age.
At a
That's
very
the,
young age.
that's the thing is it's the young age that I think that makes it so unique, you know,
Yes.
because I mean, there's that on track and field. You're competing against your teammates in track and field.
Sure, but you're older and you've
Right.
got
You're a little older.
more mental capacity to deal with it, I think.
Yes.
Cognitive capacity to deal with it. So you make the decision. How did that change your life?
Oh my gosh, Sandy, it was, I didn't recognize it at the time,
Sure,
but
which is very hard to do.
yeah, I had no idea at the time, but coming out of it, I got depressed. I gained a lot of weight to the point where one of my teachers came up to me at school and said, "What's going on here?" And I was like, "What do you mean?"
Let let me ask this. What were you missing that caused the depression?
Well, I didn't know what to do with my time.
Mm,
Because when you're on a gymnastics team and your gymnastics friends are your friends, and then
right.
you leave the team, you still want them to be your friends, but they're all practicing all the time.
Right. That's right.
So you're waiting for them, like, oh, can you spend the night on Friday night? That kind of stuff. And then you haven't really fully formed friendships with your classmates at school because you were so busy with gymnastics.
So you're now like an outsider for around everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And also at that age, no one because I don't think anybody else was thinking about it. It's not like somebody was thinking about it and keeping information from me,
Right, right.
but no one was thinking about like, oh, wow, you just basically quit your full-time job. What are you going to do
Yes.
now?
Yes.
And so nobody really talked to me about it. And except other than to say, we noticed you've gained some weight. Um, no one really said like, hey, what are you going to do now?
Because you'd been doing this since you were 4 years old.
Right.
And you're now 13, 14 years old. And some of you out there may be like, well, she's a teenager. She's got the rest of her life ahead of her. But if you look at any athlete, that's what you were living. That was your dream. And I'm sure you had a dream. Your goal was to go to the Olympics. Is that not what every gymnast
100,
dream is?
100%.
Yeah.
Every gymnast
Yeah.
and having adults tell you that they think you can.
Right. And even like preparing, like possibly to go to Romania to a camp, that says your end goal is the Olympics.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, at this awkward age of 13, 14 years old, your life's passion is gone. Your
Yep.
family, your friend, well, not your family, but your friends, your whole community, you're now an outsider
Yep.
and you don't really have any strong connections to other people outside of your family.
Right.
S-
And the other thing that you give up when you make that decision is accolades.
Yes.
So when I would go, so at the school that I went to was a really small school, and when I would go to a competition, if I won in assembly at school, the headmaster would get up and sort of, talk about what was going on for the week or whatever, and then give shout outs because I went to a school that was full of athletes. It was a tennis school, and give shout outs to so and so won their tennis match this weekend. Oh, look, Jennifer Lazar won her competition this weekend, whatever.
Right.
All that goes away. You
Mm-hmm.
no longer like, um, one of the things that used to happen in our family is that when my dad he entertained a lot for his business, and people would come to our house for cocktails and hors d'oeuvres or whatever before they were going out. And my dad would say, Jennifer, come down and turn some flips, for my guests or whatever. And so I would go downstairs and, turn some flips in the living room, and everybody would ooh and ah and whatever. And that doesn't happen anymore. I mean,
And
occasionally my dad would still do it because I could still do the flips,
right.
but all of that just stopped. And I couldn't have known that. And so then you're like, "Oh my gosh, nobody acknowledges me anymore.
Right.
I'm not special anymore. I'm just a kid, and I don't really know what to do with my time." And so what I did was I joined the volleyball team. Um, but because I mean, I'm only this tall, and
Okay, okay. So for the listeners out there, what does that equate to since they can't see?
I'm 5'2".
5'2". Okay.
And I may not have been 5'2" yet in the 7th grade, I don't know. So I was, so I wasn't like I wasn't gonna be a great spiker or anything.
Right.
And I went to play volleyball, but I didn't have a ride to volleyball workouts. And so I could only get to certain number of workouts, and so the coach wouldn't let me play in
Yeah.
games. So I loved volleyball, but it wasn't it wasn't the same level of
Sure.
athleticism and all of that, but I still loved it. So
Right.
I tried volleyball, I tried cross country, um, and I hated it. I'm not a runner.
Right.
And so I tried some other sports first, and that didn't work. And so then I became a gymnastics coach when I was like 14 or 15.
I did not know that either.
So then I went back to the gym that I had come from, and I became a coach. And
Oh, let me dive into this. So how did that coaching come about?
um I think that I don't really know exactly what happened, but I feel like my coach kind of said, "Listen, we need a teacher. Do you want to come teach toddlers?" And I was like,
Oh,
"Sure." I mean,
right.
teaching toddlers gymnastics is so fun. And so I ended up, and it was really interesting because I was 14 years old, and so this was in the early 80s, like 1982, 1983. And
Mhm.
I was getting paid like $10 an hour. I got
Woohoo.
paid more than anybody I knew who was babysitting or, whatever
Right.
they were doing at 14 years old. And I was working with, do you remember Diane Durham? She was one of
No.
Bella Caroli's gymnasts in Houston.
Mm-mm.
She came and coached with, we did summer gymnastics camps. And so I got to coach with, an Olympic gymnast. And I coached in the summers, especially, and then sometimes during the school year, um, until I went to boarding school my last 2 years of high school, but then I coached for a time in college too.
Oh,
Um,
let's take one time out. So I want to ask this. So your approach to coaching, one, was it uncomfortable to get back in the gym for you? And two, how did your previous experiences affect how you coached these young girls?
that's a really interesting question, Sandy, because when I got back in the gym coaching, um, it was a way to sort of piece back together my family, my
Mhm.
gymnastics family,
Right.
um, and be in the gym and be around what was familiar and, all those
Sure.
things. And also to have my own spending money, which was really nice at that age.
Right.
And I didn't recognize it, but I started coaching the way that I had been coached. And
Oh,
because that's all
yeah.
I knew, right?
That's right.
So I started coaching that way. And when I was not in college, but later on, I moved to San Francisco when I was in my early 20s. And I started coaching at a gym in San Francisco. And I started noticing that I didn't like the way that I was treating these little girls because I was coaching from a place of fear and making the same thing I was mirroring what had happened to
Sure.
me,
Which is natural. It's
which is
natural to do.
natural of, try and what's also interesting is that San Francisco being the place that it is versus Memphis,
Right.
Tennessee being the place that
Right.
it is,
Right.
these little girls were going to push back on me and
Yeah.
say, "You can't talk to me like that."
So is that what brought it to your attention? Like, how did you start recognizing that the girls
I
started pushing
started
back?
recognizing some of that, and I started recognizing, I think a parent actually said something to me about it because the parents were allowed to be in the gym watching the kids exercise,
Oh,
watching the kids
yeah.
working out and stuff. And I just started to notice that I was becoming the type of coach that I didn't want to be. And I was treating little girls in a way that I had been treated that I recognized as like, whoa, that's not fair.
Right.
And so I stopped coaching. I just
So you didn't stop how you coached, you just stopped coaching.
I did because I didn't really know how to do it differently.
Ah, yeah.
And I knew that if I didn't know how to do it differently, I didn't want to hurt these girls
Sure.
emotionally.
Right.
And so I just thought for me, the best thing for me to do in that moment was to remove myself. So I did.
That's a very grown up thing to do. I mean,
Um,
yes, you are a grown up, but I mean, because I think sometimes if you don't have this tremendous love and passion, you had enough self evaluation to know I'm not the right person to do this because I don't know how to do it any differently.
right. Well, and there's this tug of war and I did decide to go off traveling too. There was that part too. But I did make the decision to stop coaching because I knew that I knew enough about coaching that I could coach these girls into winning.
Right.
I knew I could do that. What I didn't think I was capable of at the time was, can I coach them into being productive human beings who are well adjusted in the world?
Wow. Yeah.
And I knew I couldn't do that at that time. So I did not want to, I didn't want to continue the cycle.
Right.
And
You
yeah,
mentioned something that, and again, I don't think I knew you were coaching in San Francisco because
yeah,
we were friends then.
yeah.
But, you went from that, and let's talk about that little trip you took. Because
It wasn't really
isn't that the year, we won't go into really in depth, but isn't that the year you took off and hitchhiked, backpacked across Africa?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um,
So let's just do so what propelled you? So now that's a great question. So you've done this, you've come to the realization about the coaching and you've stopped that. Is that what propelled you to take a year off? And when I say she backpacked across the continent of Africa, up the side of Africa, she did.
yeah,
I don't mean just South Africa, I mean Africa.
yeah,
So what propelled you? Because I'm sure I asked you at the time, but I don't think I had any philosophical question at the time to ask you. But
yeah.
what propelled you to then go and take that year off and go to Africa?
Our dear friend Susan.
Oh,
So,
because she had just done her internship.
well, no. So for your audience, Sandy and I are connected through my best childhood friend, Susan. And Susan went to Georgetown University, and
Yes,
every year Georgetown sends 14 volunteers to South Africa to teach for
yes,
a year.
yes,
And my brother is a huge traveler, and he had spent almost 2 years in Asia.
right,
And he used to write me these incredible letters and in fact, I've saved them all. And I used to just have these incredible images and fantasies in my head of reading his letters of where he was and what he was doing and
right.
the scenery and all that.
Sure.
And so Susan went off to South Africa, and in my mind I thought, how does your best friend go and have this kind of experience and you don't know where she's been or what she's done?
Okay, let me just take one time out and give everybody kind of get everybody on the same page. So she was 200 miles from the Mozambique border.
Yep.
Yep, she was in a remote village-like thing. They didn't and
There
this
was no
and th
village.
yeah, there wasn't a village. And for guys out there, this was at the start of once she was over there, the first Gulf War started. Yes, because I
Yes,
wrote her
that's right.
letters.
That's right. Yes.
I typed up letters every day listening to the news updates of what was going on because they had access like 1 hour a week to any type of news media. And that was we recorded cassette tapes, letters, and sent them over to her. So when we say she was in a remote area, she was in a remote area of
Oh,
South
yeah.
Africa. Yeah.
The nearest actual
Yeah.
town was
Yeah.
60 miles
Yeah. Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
There was 10 miles away, there was a teeny little whistle stop that had a bar and a post office. That
Right.
was it.
Right. Okay. So I just had to throw that in.
Yeah.
And now continue with
Well, so Susan was coming home for a visit, and I said, "I'm going back with you." And I had been
right.
yeah, so I
She came
went
home in
back.
July. She came home in July.
She came
Yes.
home in July, and I said, "I'm going back to South Africa with you."
It's
So
all
we
coming
got
back to me now.
and I had never been out of the country other than to like
Oh,
Jamaica or something. I'd been to the Caribbean, but I
right.
never left the country before. And so off we go to South Africa, where it literally involved, I mean, we flew from one town to another on a crop duster.
Yeah.
And then it was another 2-hour drive. And when the nuns picked us up at the, little airport, the first thing they said to me is, "Do you want to teach?" And I went, "Okay." I mean, I don't know. Sure. So I stayed there with Susan for a couple of months. And at one point, I convinced Susan, we had a vacation, and I said, "Suze, we're going to hitchhike to Zimbabwe." And
I remember that.
she was like, "We are?" And I was like, "Yes." And I had no idea how to pack a backpack, and neither did she. And we both had our backpacks on. We looked like turtles that were about to fall over on our shells.
Oh my
And
God.
we went hitchhiking from South Africa to Zimbabwe. Um, and later on, I continued going north, and Susan had to go back to school and finish her year teaching.
Yeah.
I thought she was going to take a bus, but the bus didn't run that week. And so she ended up having to hitchhike back to South Africa by herself. We didn't we didn't
I'm
tell her
sure I
for a
I'm
long
sure
time.
I'm sure I knew that at the time.
Thankfully, we all survived.
Yes, you all survived. And Susan actually, she's actually a faculty member at St. Mary's here in Memphis.
Yep.
Shout out to that. Okay, so you basically backpacked all the way up was it the east side of
The East Coast
Africa?
of Africa,
East
yep, and
coast
through
of Africa.
Southeast Asia
Yeah.
and yeah, all the things.
So
Yeah.
what did you learn about what did and I do now remember us talking kind of when you got back about, everything that you were going through because it was a life-changing moment for you. I think travel overseas at any time is a life-changing moment. But
Absolutely.
how do you think that made you different than before you left?
I think that it gave me self-confidence that I didn't have before
You were forced
because
to. Forced
yeah,
to.
I mean, I was taking care of myself in some pretty dicey situations sometimes.
Very dicey, can I just
Yep.
add that?
Yep, there were some dicey things that happened. I mean, I was traveling in Egypt by myself, a female
As a white woman, for those that are listening and not watching the
as a
YouTube,
Jewish woman
as a Jewish
traveling
white, yeah,
in Egypt. Yeah.
yeah,
By myself. And for Susan also, we have to remember that when she was in South Africa, Nelson Mandela had been freed from prison, but he was not yet president.
yeah, that's
So
exactly
it was
right.
a politically
And the
strange,
war was still going on.
and the war was going on. There was so
Yes,
much going on.
yeah,
So anyway, so I learned a level of self-confidence that I didn't have before. Um, I became more aware of how the rest of the world sees America,
mhm.
which was fascinating to me. I had no idea that everybody in the world didn't just love America. Um, well, I mean, I was in my early 20s and I hadn't seen much of the
Well,
world
no,
yet.
and I
Do that.
laugh about that because I think everybody kind of thinks that way, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So I learned so much about travel and how to get myself from, I learned how to take care of myself in a million different ways. But I also gained a real curiosity about the
Mhm.
world.
Yeah.
And it was probably the first time that I really stepped outside of my own myself and my own upbringing to really see other
Sure.
people in the world and their cultures and the beautiful things about their cultures as well as their suffering.
Mhm.
And I mean, it was a life-changing trip for
It
me,
was. It was.
really.
Um, when you came back, did you move to Austin then, or did you stay in Memphis? Like, or did you go back to San Francisco?
Well, I went back to San Francisco. I got my old job back and I got my old apartment back. So
What was your old job?
I went and got my coaching
Oh,
job
okay.
back.
So
I
did
never did it again though. So I went to San Francisco. I went to my landlord and said, "Can I have my apartment back?" And she said yes. And I went back to the coach, the owner of the gym, and she said yes. And then I went to Memphis and fell in love with a guy
again?
who
Oh,
had
with a guy.
with a guy who
Thought you
had
meant the
just
city.
moved to Memphis and he wasn't prepared to move to San Francisco with me. And I thought, okay, so I stayed in Memphis.
It's all coming back now.
Yeah. And I went back to, and the flip side of that was I had dropped out of college to move to San Francisco. So while I was in Memphis, I went back to college and finished my degree at University of Memphis.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Um, so we're not going to go into all the aspects of your career pivots.
Yeah, there's a lot of
From
them.
There's a lot of them, and for anybody, I get asked a lot of times. I've had a couple of people reach out and say, is it too late to career pivot? Hell no! If I can just cuss for a second,
Never. I mean,
never.
I
It's
started my
yeah.
nutrition practice at 50 something years old.
That's right. That's right. So, you lived in Austin. You moved to Austin eventually. And when did you start as a masseuse when you got to Austin?
I moved to
Massage
Austin.
therapist, sorry.
I think I was 27 when I got to Austin and I flailed around for a
Yeah,
while.
did.
I did temping. I took one permanent job that didn't really work for me. I knew that from my gymnastics life, I knew that I needed a physical job. I knew that I
Okay.
was not capable of sitting behind a desk all day.
Right.
And I also knew that data entry was not going to work for me. Like
Yeah.
that just wasn't going to work for me. Um, and part of that is that, I mean, almost everything that I've done in my life, when I look back through my life, everything that I've done in my life has been about some kind of passion, one or the
Right.
other.
Right.
And when I bought my house in Austin, the woman who moved into the apartment that I left, that was across the street from the house I bought, she was in massage school and she started practicing on me. And
Oh.
and then it came back to me that when I was a little girl, My mother loved massage, and she had each one kid on each limb massaging her every night.
Oh, that's cute.
That was my job starting when I was
It's
like,
like child labor, but it's cute.
it's totally child labor, but we were all and if we were all massaging her and somebody stopped, she'd shake her arm at you and be like, "Hey,
Right.
keep going." So anyway, so this woman who moved into my old apartment was massaging me, and one night I had a dream that I was a massage therapist and I had a client on my table and I knew exactly what I was doing.
Wow.
And 6 months later, I went to massage school. The other thing I should tell you about this is, as a result of all of my injuries, I had debilitating back pain in my early 20s.
Mhm.
And I was diagnosed with 3 discs at 18. And the doctors kind of looked at me and said, "Oh, you'll probably have back surgery when you're 30." And I said, "I don't think so. That's not that's not my path."
Right.
And massage therapy was the only thing that had ever helped me with my back trouble.
Ah.
So I went to massage school, and in my second round of training, I met a woman who taught structural body work. And I just thought, this woman is going to help me. And I went to see her, and my entire body was completely different in one session. And
Wow.
I have spent the last 24 years learning those techniques
Mhm.
and using them to help people with the pain from that they got from the injuries from their sports.
Right. Which I think, it's a full circle moment there, obviously. And something that, and you've pivoted, our lives have paralleled in some ways. We've both pivoted at various times, but kind of along the same way. And, I moved back to Memphis when and I think like a year later. When did you move to San Francisco? This past year? Year ago, 2 years ago?
In 2022.
Yeah, so 2 years later, we both went through some upheavals in our life personally
Yeah.
and then job-wise and things like that. So I remember just because I love sharing funny stories and we obviously didn't compete in gymnastics or anything. So um I think it was like the Christmas of 2019 I had come home because I decided I was going to move back. And I came home to Memphis and you were there and I remember you were driving back to Austin, I was driving back to Houston, and we literally talked on the phone, like,
The whole
almost
way.
the whole way back.
That was
And we
so fun.
I know, which was great because we don't always get to talk so much, at one time, so that was always great, but, so now as we get into the end of this episode, I wanna ask you a couple of questions. What do you think your biggest value is to others now? It's always a tough
My
question.
Well, yeah, I mean, so my biggest value is, well, and I've always said this about my body work practice, is it's very rare that someone walks into my office with a pain or an injury that I've never had.
And okay,
Outside
okay.
of massive injuries, car
Right,
accidents,
right,
things like that,
right.
but I've experienced a lot of physical pain in my life, and I think that that gives me a lot of compassion
Sure,
and insight for other people. Um, so that is something that I feel that I can bring value to people, um, because I will work tirelessly to help them figure
sure,
out. If it's and if and I have no if it's not me, if my work isn't helpful for them, then hopefully I know the right person for them.
sure.
So I think that's it. And I and all, my gymnastics gave me perseverance,
It's a good one.
and with my nutrition work, we leave no stone unturned,
Right.
and that is I think that's valuable to people.
Sure, I agree with that. So the last question, what would you tell a 10-year-old Jennifer?
Hmm. Um, I would probably tell a 10-year-old Jennifer that she has a voice
Mm, that's a good
and and that she should use it.
mhm, that's a good one. Okay, thank you, Jennifer, so much for being on my podcast today. I
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
and I've learned so much that I didn't even know. So I think that's just awesome. As I said, thank you for sharing your unique perspective as a former athlete and one that started so young and actually ended young. I think it's a great, different perspective than what we have had so far on the show. And I'm all about sharing different types of athletes and different types of sports. And everybody has a different story to tell. And I think it's just fascinating. If you want to learn more about Jennifer and what she does and how she can possibly help you can visit her website at Jennifer Lazar, LAZAR.com. I'll have the link in the show notes. And as we wrap up this episode of the fifth quarter, thank you all for listening, sharing our episodes, and your comments and show reviews. I appreciate each and every one of you for all of your support. Jen, do you have any last comments before I close this out?
Well, I just want to say, Sandy, thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun to do this with you. And while we've been talking, I don't know if your listeners know about your other life as a photographer, but I've been looking at the photograph that's on the wall behind you that I know you took.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
just, yeah, anyway, so I mean, you're a very talented person
Oh,
in
you're
so
sweet.
many ways, and I'm really grateful. Thank you for having me.
You are quite welcome. This has been so much fun. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of the Fifth Quarter Podcast with our guest, former gymnast Jennifer Lazar. Until next time, change is your ally and it paves the way for greatness. Have a great rest of the week.